Vice President of Operations for the Four Freedoms Park Conservancy. The Conservancy, for those of you who don't know, was established to maintain and operate the park in partnership with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Our park is a public space dedicated to celebrating and honoring the life and legacy of President Franklin Roosevelt and the Four Freedoms through educational initiatives and public programming, such as today's event commemorating the 70th anniversary of the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. I hope that many of you have already been able to participate in the ongoing workshop in our programming tent. If you have yet to do so, we invite you to make a red paper rose and plant it in our rose garden, which you'll see behind you, that we have created in honor of today's anniversary. As you will see illustrated in your programs, roses decorate the Roosevelt family crest. A rose garden also appeared in some of Louis Kahn's initial sketches for the park, so we felt that the rose was a fitting floral tribute for today. We're going to begin today's program by laying a wreath at the FDR bust. I am pleased to introduce Judith Abebe, a longtime Roosevelt Island resident, who is here representing the United Nations, where she works in the Visitor Services Department, and Jim Bates, President of the Roosevelt Island Disabled Association, which is an independent, not-for-profit organization located on Roosevelt Island, providing transportations to its members, wheelchairs, scooters, and canes as needed to anyone living on Roosevelt Island. Judith and Jim. We'd also like to invite anyone, throughout the afternoon, if you brought flowers or if you made paper roses, please feel free to either plant them in the garden or spread them up here underneath the bust and underneath the wreath. We'd like this to be a participatory event. We get some nice pictures. Thank you both. Introduce Harvey Kaye, Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Professor Kaye is the author of The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great, and we are delighted that he's here with us to discuss the legacy of President Roosevelt. Professor Kaye, thank you.
I had two versions of what I was going to say, and I decided to make it a third version, basically. But to start, I want to read to you a eulogy given on the occasion of FDR's passing. It's very short, and it'll be self-explanatory. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, just 3 months into his fourth term and only 63 years old, passed away in Warm Springs, Georgia. Asked to provide a short eulogy for nationwide broadcast, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Robert Sherwood, who had joined FDR's White House team in 1940 and directed the Overseas Division of the Office of War Information during the war years, wrote the following, and this was broadcast over the radio nationally. To those of us who knew and loved the President, the greatest memory we hold today is the memory of his indomitable good humor, his indomitable courage, his love for our country, his faith in our country. It was that love and that faith, Sherwood stated, which not only enabled Roosevelt to confront the crises of economic depression and war without fear or hesitation, it also made him, as Sherwood put it, one with every man who fought for our country. Indeed, Sherwood said, and I quote again, "There wasn't a moment when Roosevelt wasn't spiritually on the front line with the men who were fighting for freedom." And finally, after urging Americans to honor their fallen president by pledging renewed and increased devotion to the country and the cause which he serves himself so valiantly and for which he, Roosevelt, gave his life, Sherwood declared, "We do not surrender to death. We would not surrender to the Nazis or Japanese. We continue to stand up and fight for our country and for our cause. We continue to fight for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Now, I was going to lay out a mini history of the New Deal, which I'm sure most of you know. The Great Depression was devastating American life. The New Deal, the idea of government initiatives mobilizing Americans to give their labors to combat the Depression by way of relief efforts, recovery efforts, reconstruction efforts, and most powerfully, reform efforts. Efforts that included not only Social Security and not only the National Labor Relations Act, but the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and so on, the many alphabet soup agencies that we know of. Roosevelt was more, however, than just a great... In fact, let me rephrase it. Roosevelt wasn't just a top-down president with all of these many initiatives, as historians too often present him. Roosevelt was the kind of figure, the kind of leader we need more of, the kind of leader who not only said and promised and followed through on fighting for us, Roosevelt encouraged the fight in us. And what I mean by that is, in the 1930s, as I said, not only did he mobilize Americans' labors to combat the New Deal, he also empowered them. He empowered them to make America freer, more equal, and more democratic. And in the 1930s, we often forget, by way of Roosevelt's invitation and mobilization, the labor movement expanded dramatically. The consumer campaigns of the 30s were unprecedented, known as the Housewives Movement. And the civil rights organizations that we came to know of following World War II, the NAACP and CORE especially, they begin their mobilizations on a grand scale in the late 1930s. So this is a time of not only fighting the Depression, it's also a time of empowerment, all of which enabled Americans to actually fight in World War II and actually to win the battles that would lead to the realization of the four freedoms. And the last thing I want to say is that it was a generation that never forgot the four freedoms. So if you follow them from 1935 as they grew up and faced fascism and Japanese imperialism, and you think about it, in 1965, when my own generation laid claim to a decade, it was actually my parents' generation, maybe your grandparents' generation, that really did make the 60s, because they were the ones who elected the presidents. They were the ones who enacted the legislation that we know of as Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the environmental protections, the occupational safety and health protections, the consumer protections, and dramatically changed American immigration law for the better. America had been closed effectively to immigration since 1924. They remembered the ideals of the four freedoms, and in 1965 transformed our laws and opened immigration once again. So the best we can do, I think, on this occasion is not simply to honor and remember, to my mind, the greatest president in American history, but also to try to perhaps live up to the ideals that he encouraged, not only in his administration, but also in his fellow citizens. Thank you.